plant uptake and yield. Now, in contrast to that, in organic agriculture, the National Organic Program, or the NOP, prohibits the use of synthetic fertilizers, right? So there's this focus on feeding the soil to feed the crop. Now, these must become plant available. So they're in organic forms. They must mineralize, which I'll talk about in just a second, to be able for the plants to actually take them up. Also, in organic agriculture, we tend to have these layered sources of fertility. So here, if you think of a regular organic vegetable farm, you have different plots of different ages, different layers of fertility. You've added manure, compost, all these different things over time to really feed the soil. All right, so must become plant available. What am I talking about there? We're talking about mineralization. So plants typically take up the ion form of most nutrients. So they must take up the elemental form of most nutrients. Most organic fertilizers, soils, cover crops, they're bound in these like organic complexes, proteins and other large organic complexes that must be broken down by microorganisms in the soil. Phosphorus and potassium in organic systems are usually fairly plant available with these sources. They're often either mineralized in the soil or mineralized in the product before we apply, or we can use the salt for those, but nitrogen, not so much. Okay, so here, if we think about plant uptake and nutrient release, here, can you see my mouse? Here, there on the y-axis, you have the nutrient, and here on the x-axis, you have the time. The green line is plant uptake. So, right, you have these small plants at the beginning taking up small amounts of nutrient, and as they grow and start putting on fruit, they increase their nutrient uptake. And we have our nutrient release done by the red line. So if we have too much nutrient release, too much mineralization, we have a large gap for potential loss. And in contrast, here on the bottom, again, the green line is plant uptake, the red line is nutrient release. We end up with a deficit, right? We don't have enough mineralization, enough nutrients for our plants to really thrive. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through an animation of nitrogen mineralization. So like I said, most of the organic nitrogen is in these complex forms that must be broken down before our plants can take them up. So here's an example of organic nitrogen, things like proteins, amino acids, uric acid. They must undergo mineralization. And this is done by microorganisms and enzymes in the soil. Then that forms ammonium, which then undergoes nitrification to form nitrate. So again, both of those are microbial done, so they're reliant on water and temperature and other environmental factors. Our ammonium and nitrate can then be taken up by our plants directly. That's that ion form I've been talking about. Okay, so that's the mineralization process. When we have these ammonium and nitrate forms in the soil, we can also get immobilization, which is where the microorganisms kind of grab up those nutrients from the soil. We can have nitrate leaching. That's when rainfall or irrigation actually pushes the nitrate out of the soil zone. Or we can have ammonia volatilization. That's when the ammonium is lost as gas. So as you can imagine, it's really difficult to predict how much and when nitrogen becomes available from these organic sources. Okay, so the sources of fertility in organic systems, they must be on the NOP list, allowed by a certifier or OMRI approved. So these are things like manures, compost, cover crops, and commercial organic fertilizers. There are a few salts that are allowed in organic production. That means they're already in the ion form, and they're allowed in organic production because they're mined. So for nitrogen, we can apply Chilean nitrate, which is also known as sodium nitrate. We can apply potassium sulfate, and we can apply rock phosphate. A lot of people don't take into account how much nitrogen comes from the soil, but in organic systems, we know that this is also a major part of that. Okay, so we have to think about differently about fertility in organic systems, but I also want to say not. So, we have all this good information from conventional ag. How can we apply some of those same principles in organics, but also take into account the different areas of organics that kind of also add nutrient buffers? So contrasting conventional and organic production, right? In organics, it's not immediately plant available. There are layers of fertility, different sources of fertility. The timing is really important and difficult to match release. And sourcing is different, right? So, the focus on local production, they're often more expensive, sometimes not. Are they OMRI certified? But what's the same is that in both practices, we're trying to meet plant demand. We're going to maximize yields. We always want to reduce our inputs and reduce our costs. And really, we want to apply what plants need. And we want to apply what plants need to maximize crop yield, but also reduce environmental contamination. And here on this graph on the right, we have a traditional plant uptake, traditional fertilizer curve. On the y-axis, we have like the crop yield, and we have the fertilizer rate of nitrogen. And what's important to notice is that there's this area of where fertilizer additions don't become profitable anymore. You aren't increasing yields. So in organic systems, we also want to find kind of this peak maximum where we're applying the right amount of fertilizer, maximizing yield, and reducing the potential for money lost and also nutrients lost. Okay, so these layers of fertility I keep talking about, it is really complicated, and that's one of the takeaways from today. It's a lot of different sources. But here again, on the y-axis, I'm going to show you a few of these mineralization curves. We have mineral nitrogen in pounds of nitrogen per day, and then time on the x-axis. And what I want you to see from this is essentially we have these different rates of release from these different layers. So again, here's our crop demand, right? It starts off small when our plants, they're small, and then it gets higher as we reach kind of, harvest time. We have a certain amount of nitrogen coming from the soil, a certain amount of nitrogen coming from the cover crops that we had, and then we also have a certain amount of nitrogen coming from our fertilizers. And the idea is how can we really understand and try to synchronize the best we can to reduce any issues with under or over fertility. All right, so moving on to the soil. David filled me in a little bit on your soils. It sounds like there's a lot of similarity here in Georgia with our soils to yours. Less clay with y'all, but kind of these highly weathered soils that aren't necessarily always super nutrient rich. So we kind of have these three major chemical components that drive a lot of the nitrogen fertility, right? pH, across the board, we're usually hoping for about 6 to 6.5. That ensures maximum nutrient availability. The CEC of a soil, the cation exchange capacity, is the ability of a soil to hold nutrients, right? So the higher the CEC, the better your soil is at reducing leaching. Like I said, the soils I work with are highly weathered soils. It sounds like y'all have very low clay soils, so there's not a lot of inherent CEC in the soils. So what we need to focus on is building organic matter. Organic matter will depend on your inputs, your soil management, and your climate. So what I wanted to show you here is kind of the typical CEC of a coastal plain soil, which here in Georgia is a very sand soil. That's about 6 milliequivalents. A peanut soil, which is where I'm located, which is like kind of a medium clay soil, lots of silt. We have about 6 to 12 milliequivalents. And then in other areas, around 9. So a lot of the times you have low CEC. But what I want to show you is that organic matter has a CEC of 200 to 400 milliequivalents. So by increasing the organic matter of your soil, you can greatly increase the CEC. And that also helps you with nutrient release, but also maintaining nutrients. Okay, so in organics, we have lots of focus on building soil organic matter, but I think a lot of the times we think about increasing soil organic matter to the point where we aren't concerned about quality and also kind of reasonable expectations of what a soil in your region should be, right? So taking into account organic matter building, maybe more so than looking at a percent of organic matter you're trying to hit. Okay, so when we're doing organic farming, we're not just talking about, carbon that we're putting in. We're talking about organic molecules that contain nitrogen and phosphorus and all these micronutrients that we want. So I think that a lot of the times we talk about seeing these massive increases in organic matter of like 1 to 2 to 5%. But really have a realistic expectation of more of, 0.5% per year, 0.25% per year, and pay attention to what it is for your type of soil. If you're in a very sandy soil, 2 to 3% organic matter, you're doing great because it's really hard to maintain that. So, expectations to match your soil type, because not all soils are the same. All right, so the soil test. So I wanted to show you two different soil tests. This is one of our soil tests from a UGA extension office, and this is one from Waypoint Analytical, which is a private lab. And what I'm sure many of you have seen these, what I wanted to show you is we can get soil pH, we can get soil buffering capacity, we can get phosphorus, potassium, and all these other micro and macronutrients. We can also get organic matter, okay? What I want to show you here is that the Waypoint does give you an estimated nitrogen release, but the UGA extension laboratory does not give you a nitrogen release. Most laboratories do not give a nitrogen release because it's just not very accurate. We've tried and tried and tried to come up with quick tests to predict nitrogen release. We're just not there. So take these numbers with a grain of salt. It's something to look at, but it's not a given. And if you're using a state laboratory, it's very likely that you're not going to get a potentially nitrogen release from your soil test. All right, so what do we do, right? We're not predicting nitrogen from soil test. We apply nitrogen based off of crop demand, okay? So if you look here, back on this test, I think I did this one for broccoli. So right here it says I need 150 to 180 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's how much the crop needs. That's assuming that none is coming from the soil. Okay, but we know that's not true. A significant amount of plant available nitrogen does come from our soil, especially in conventional and organic soils with lots of organic inputs. Okay, so I want to show you some nitrogen mineralization work that I did on 3 different farms. These 3 different farms were different ages. One was a fairly new piece of land. One was a medium and one was middle-aged farm, and one has the one that's been organically farmed for a while. So here you can see in farm 1, which is my middle-aged one, the organic matter is about 6.5%. Farm 2 is my newer farm, and farm 3 is my older farm at 8.8% organic matter. This TN is total nitrogen, which we can measure. And again, you can see I had different levels of total nitrogen in these farms, the lowest in the new farm, the highest in the old farm. Then I measured initial inorganic nitrogen. That's how much ammonium and nitrates just floating around in the soil. And then I measured how much nitrogen mineralized from each one of these. And what I really want to focus on is this last column here. We have mineralizable nitrogen in pounds per acre. The newest farm had the least amount of soil nitrogen coming. The middle farm had the most amount of soil nitrogen coming, and then the older farm was the middle. So we can't always match organic matter to potentially mineralizable nitrogen. Okay, but what I recommend to do is to assume that soils with a high organic matter or history of lots of organic nitrogen inputs, have this potential to supply nitrogen to crops. Again, very difficult to predict. So what can we do? One thing I do recommend is to track your changes in soil organic matter. Noticing that differences in your percent organic matter from year to year is matter a lot more than one time point. Track the total nitrogen of your farm, have a feeling on how much you're putting down, and track phosphorus. In organic systems, it accumulates very quickly, and it's a good idea to keep your eye on that. A lot of the farmers I know, as they watch their organic matter build, they start to cut back on those fertilizer applications. So, they first start with a quarter and then a half, and then they're kind of able to balance the differences of these rich organic soils with plant needs. Okay, so into cover crops. All right, we all know there's a huge benefit of cover crops, right? Like it adds a lot of organic matter, it adds nitrogen, it suppresses weeds, it improves soil structure, it attracts beneficials, and go on and on and on. But I want to talk about it from a nitrogen standpoint. So when we talk about fertility, there's kind of 2 main groups. There's legumes, which are things like cover clover, sun hemp, and cowpea. And then there's also our biomass and what I call scavengers. These are things like radish and wheat and rye. So legumes are actually actively fixing nitrogen in the soil, right? They create a relationship with bacteria in the soil and fix and add nitrogen to our soil. Our biomass and scavengers actually are grabbing our leftover fertilizers. So, right, we put out a certain amount of fertilizer, our plants take up some of it, and every year there is some left in the soil. Things like radishes and wheat and these deep-rooted crops pull up a lot of that leftover nitrogen, bringing it back to the surface for us. So they're also a really important part of adding nitrogen in your farm. Okay, again, how much will I get and how do I predict that from my cover crops? Again, it's highly dependent on the crop, on the type of cover crop that you have, how much biomass you get, the stage of harvest that you're killing or terminating or incorporating it at, the amount of nitrogen that the legumes fixed, and also the amount of nitrogen that the scavengers brought up to the surface and how much organic matter they're adding. Okay, there's a big variation, but there are some pretty sound numbers that we can pull on. And I'm going to show you a tool in just a second to play around with. But I just wanted to show you some kind of averages across the board of these. So for instance, hairy vetch can pull about 141 pounds per acre. So once you terminate it, incorporate it, you get a release of about 141. Crimson clover, 115. Austrian winter pea, 144. And rye, who is our scavenger in this situation, get bigger biomass, about 5,600 pounds per acre, and less nitrogen, right? Because it's not actively fixing it, scavenging it. And that nitrogen will change depending on how rich the soil is that you're growing in. But again, a big difference in the type of cover crops and how much nitrogen they put out. All right, so can we predict it? There's been a lot of work over, I'd probably like the past, I don't know, 20 or 30 years trying to predict nitrogen availability from cover crops. And they have recently come out with this tool. This is a big group. They're down here at the bottom from Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Maryland, and other states all working together. They pull in a NASA weather station to figure out your local weather conditions. And they help predict nitrogen using this tool. So I would highly recommend looking up this cover crop nitrogen calculator. The way that it works is you tell it what cover crop you planted. You tell it when you terminated it. You can give some inputs of biomass, which are pretty easy to estimate. And if you're interested in that, I'd be glad to share an extension bulletin on how to do that. It also will then fit in some fresh biomass and other parameters. Then you tell it about what cash crop you want to grow, and it figures out how much your nitrogen needs are based off of a yield goal, and it gives you a target nitrogen fertilizer rate. And you go through, and you type in a few other parameters of the cover crop that are like set into the program, and then it gives you this output. Okay, so I'm going to show you first a grass cover crop example that's scavenger. So for example, this is rye. It was terminated in March. The biomass is around 5,000 pounds per acre. And these are variables that are fit from the model. And what it does is it shows you your cover crop nitrogen release here on this y-axis and your date and time. So again, here's your corn uptake curve, that yellow line. And the green line is the cover crop of nitrogen released. What happened here was no cover crop nitrogen was released from the rye, right? So the rye had a bunch of biomass, a bunch of carbon in it, fairly low nitrogen, and you didn't get a lot of nitrogen release. But that's okay, because you were growing your rye for organic matter or some other need, right? But you know that you need to apply more fertilizer nitrogen in this situation. All right, so let's contrast that to a legume cover crop. So for example, we have our species of clover, crimson clover. It had a dry biomass of about 3,500 pounds per acre. And here again, you see that corn uptake curve, cover crop nitrogen release curve. And what I want to show you here is you did get some about 32 pounds per acre released from your nitrogen there. So there you can subtract those 32 pounds from the amount 150 that you were supposed to add, and you can reduce your fertilizer application based off of this model. All right, getting into fertilizers. Okay, so there's a huge variety of fertilizers available for organic growers, and a huge variation in them in those as well. Okay, so some of the ones that seem to be most commonly used are things like feather meal, blood meal, bone meal, pelleted poultry litter, pelleted mix, and raw poultry litter. These vary anywhere from 15 to 4% total nitrogen. So like the 1300 that you see on your bag. Again, how much nitrogen will depend on what type of fertilizer that you're using. So we did a study looking at 50 different organic fertilizers, and what we found was there was this huge variation in how much of that total nitrogen was actually released to our plants. So here, for an example, I want to show you this green line right here is blood meal. So this is how much plant available nitrogen out of what was applied became available. So if the bag says 15% nitrogen for blood meal, we got about 80% of that over the growing season under ideal temperature and water conditions. We can contrast that to something like a pelleted poultry mix, where we saw only about 50% of that nitrogen become available over the season. Okay, and if we put this in the field, how much do they mineralize and how quickly do they become available? Feather meal, we've noticed mineralizes very rapidly under field conditions. Here's plant available nitrogen in pounds per acre, and here's a date for a tomato field we worked in. This is how much, the black line, how much we got from our soil. We got about 75 pounds per acre just from our soil alone. And this is our fertilizer plus soil. So you can see with our feather meal, we got close to about 150 pounds per acre, which was perfect for our tomatoes when we added them together. If we look at a Harmony, which is a pelleted poultry litter, what we had was much less nitrogen available. So applied at the same rate, but the mineralization was much lower, much less total nitrogen from the Harmony. Doesn't mean it's a bad fertilizer, but if you're trying to hit your target nitrogen needs, you need to take this into account, right? Okay, so some yield data. I did 2 years of different studies looking at both tomatoes and broccoli with 8 different fertilizers. And this was done in North Georgia. And I applied the fertilizer at a rate of 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So we looked at blood meal, feather meal, symphony, fish meal, compost, and then nothing. Right here, we have average pounds per acre. And what I wanted to show you was I got the best yields with the blood and the feather meal. And I think that is correlated to the amount of nitrogen mineralized from those products. So I got the most nitrogen recovery, the most mineralization from blood and feather meal in that situation, which led to higher yields compared to my control. Okay, so what does this mean? So we know this mineralization rate. So if I were to apply 500 pounds of fertilizer per acre, how much am I actually getting? Here you can see the total nitrogen applied and the cost. So what I want to show you with this figure is that, just because a fertilizer is less expensive, if you're not getting as much nutrient from that, it might not be the best cost benefit analysis for you on that. So feather meal costs more, but when we actually look at per unit of nitrogen, we get a lower cost overall. Okay, similarly with poultry litter has a lower nitrogen rate. If I put out 2 tons per acre, I can look at my per nitrogen unit cost, but you have to be careful with those raw litters in organic systems. All right, so that was a lot, but what I hope you got from that was that we need to take kind of this multi-pronged approach and understanding soil health and fertility and cover crops. So I recommend taking routine soil tests and working with your extension providers to help with the interpretation and also getting into some of these tools. Work on building the organic matter solely. Don't worry about dumping out lots of compost. This is okay to do this over time through cover crops and other things. I often recommend an unfertilized plot if you can. That'll really help you see how your soil nitrogen is doing over time, especially if you've been farming the same piece of land for 5 to 10 years. And try reducing those recommended rates as you see this increase in organic matter in total nitrogen. Be careful about applications. It's so easy to under and over apply, especially if you're working on smaller plots. And really work to choose fertility to meet plant demand. So if you know you've got a hungry feeder, take something like blood or feather meal. And if you have something with a little bit less nitrogen, look towards a slower release fertilizer. And really watch those phosphorus levels. They build up very, very quickly, especially when you're using a lot of these pelleted poultry products, composts, or manures. All right, that's it.